So imagine you are standing on the coast of northern Australia. It is 1943.
Right in the middle of the war.
Exactly. And you're part of this civilian patrol, right? You're just staring out at the horizon, waiting for the Japanese invasion fleet that everyone says is coming any day now.
The tension must have been unbelievable.
Oh, absolutely. And then suddenly you see them, these like white uniforms advancing through this really intense heat haze.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you totally panic. I mean, you're screaming for backup. The invasion is here. But as they get closer, well, you realize you're just looking at 3 large local birds.
3 birds. That is incredible.
Yeah, 3 brolgas, just birds. But that is exactly how terrified Australia was during World War II. But I think the craziest part is that the real invasion was actually already being debated and, well, canceled in a Tokyo boardroom.
Yeah, it really is one of the most chilling, what-ifs of the entire 20th century.
For sure.
We are looking at a scenario here where the map of the Pacific was just terrifyingly close to being completely and permanently redrawn.
And to figure out how close we actually came to that, we've got a massive stack of sources for today's deep dive.
A really great stack today.
Yeah, we're pulling from academic counterfactual studies, some declassified documents straight from the Australian War Memorial, and these really incredibly detailed records of secret Japanese military debates from 1942.
Right, which are fascinating.
So our mission today is to explore this question: what if Imperial Japan had actually successfully invaded and occupied Australia? Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the primary sources here are just incredible because, they give us the exact meeting minutes and diary entries of the actual men who were deciding the fate of the Pacific in real time.
Which is wild to read. So
Yeah.
just to set the stage for you, early 1942 was a really dark time for the Allies.
Very dark.
The fall of Singapore had just happened on February 15th. And I mean, that was supposed to be this impregnable British fortress, right?
Yeah.
And it just collapsed.
Yeah, overnight, basically.
Right. So the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, he stands up and tells the Australian public, quote, "The fall of Singapore opens the battle for Australia." I mean, panic is totally setting in.
You really have to put yourself in the shoes of an Australian civilian at that exact moment.
Yeah.
Most of their fighting men are overseas in other theaters. The British Navy, which was, their traditional protector, is just stretched completely to the breaking point.
But you're on their own.
Exactly. The continent feels completely undefended. But what's fascinating is what was happening on the Japanese side at the same time.
Right, because Tokyo definitely knew the Allies were terrified.
Oh, they smelled blood in the water. And to understand their mindset, you have to look at what historians call the victory disease.
The victory disease. That sounds like a psychological thing.
It basically is. By early 1942, the Japanese military had achieved all their initial strategic goals. Their Stage 1 objectives were done in record time.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, they'd swept through Southeast Asia, captured the Netherlands, East Indies for oil, decimated the Allied fleet. So they were experiencing this, extreme overconfidence.
Just total euphoria.
Exactly. A euphoria of victory that just permeated the Imperial Japanese Navy's high command.
So they're looking at the map, seeing all these dominoes fall, and just asking, well, why stop now?
Precisely. But here's the thing. It wasn't a unified push.
Wait, really?
Oh, no. The invasion of Australia sparked this fiercely bitter inter-service rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army.
Wait, so the Army and the Navy just bickered about it? Like, they were fighting each other?
It was incredibly intense. The Navy, specifically Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, he headed the Navy General Staff's planning section. He desperately wanted to invade northern Australia.
Why Australia specifically, though? Just for the land?
No, they didn't look at it as an empty desert. They viewed Australia as a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier.
An unsinkable aircraft carrier. That really paints a target on the entire continent for you.
Right. Because the Navy understood that the U.S. was going to strike back eventually. And they knew Australia was the absolute only logical staging ground for General Douglas MacArthur to gather his troops.
Oh, to launch a counteroffensive against Japan?
Exactly. The Navy's argument was basically, we take Northern Australia right now, or the Americans are going to use it to destroy us later.
That makes total strategic sense from their perspective. But if the Navy was riding so high on this victory disease, why didn't they just force the issue?
Because the Army held the ultimate trump card.
Which was?
Troops and logistics. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and the Army strongly opposed the invasion. They actually called the Navy's plan Gibberish.
Gibberish. That's a pretty strong word to throw around in a top-secret military strategy meeting.
Well, the Army was rooted in the harsh reality of numbers. They calculated that to conquer a continent that size, they would need at least 12 divisions of combat troops.
12 divisions.
And more importantly, 1 million tons of merchant shipping just to move and supply those men.
1 million tons. I mean, that sounds like a logistical nightmare, even if it wasn't wartime.
It was impossible. The Army was already bogged down in this massive war in China, and they were terrified of the Soviet threat up north in Manchuria.
Right, they had other problems.
Exactly. So to them, sending 12 divisions to the other side of the equator was basically strategic suicide.
Okay, so the actual invasion is off the table. The Army vetoes it. But they can't just ignore Australia if it's going to be this giant staging ground for the Americans. What was the backup plan?
They agreed on a compromise called Operation FS.
Operation FS, what was that?
Instead of a physical invasion, the goal was to completely isolate Australia. They planned to capture Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia.
Oh, so they were trying to sever the lifeline between the U.S. and Australia.
Yeah, cutting the cord. They wanted to bully Australia into surrendering through a suffocating naval blockade and psychological warfare.
Wait, hold on. If the Army is saying, hey, we don't have 1 million tons of shipping for an invasion, how do they pull off Operation FS?
That is a great question.
I mean, blockading an entire continent requires an enormous navy. Aren't they totally contradicting themselves?
Yes. That exact logical flaw is what doomed the strategy.
Oh, yeah.
Because, we connect this to the bigger picture, Operation FS was basically a massive bluff.
A bluff.
Yeah. At this point, the Japanese merchant fleet was bleeding out. They were already losing something like 100,000 tons of shipping a month to American submarines.
100,000 tons a month, so their supply lines were just incredibly fragile.
Extremely.
Oh.
And it makes even less sense when you look at Japanese military doctrine at the time. They didn't rely on massive supply trains like the Americans did.
Oh, they didn't?
No, they relied heavily on local foraging and this concept called seishin.
Seishin, what is that?
It translates roughly to spiritual morale. The core belief was that fighting spirit could overcome material shortages.
So like sheer willpower.
Right. If you run out of food or bullets, your devotion to the emperor will just carry you through to victory.
I mean, that's like trying to run an ultramarathon across the desert without packing any water and just hoping you'll find a puddle along the way because you have a really good attitude.
That is a brutally accurate analogy, and we have the grim historical evidence to prove it. The sources bring up the New Guinea campaign, which was basically a smaller test run for this southern advance.
Okay, and what happened in New Guinea?
It was a total catastrophe. Upwards of 97% of Japanese military deaths there were attributed to starvation and tropical disease.
Wait, really? 97%? Not even from combat?
Not from combat. The records literally say they withered on the vine. Now, imagine projecting that disaster onto the Australian outback.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the heat, the massive distances.
Exactly. If they couldn't forage in New Guinea, they were never going to survive the outback.
Yeah.
Which is exactly why the idea of a massive invasion force was pure fantasy.
So the Army was completely right. It would have been an unparalleled disaster for their own troops.
Absolutely. But, and this is where it gets really dark, the logistical impossibility didn't stop them from planning the aftermath.
What do you mean?
Even though the invasion was doomed, the High Command created incredibly detailed blueprints for what they would do after Australia surrendered.
Oh, you mean the puppet state stuff?
Yeah.
This blew my mind in the sources. Tokyo was literally prepping the paperwork to run the country.
Yeah, a group called the Total War Research Institute, under Lieutenant General Murakami Kaisaku, they drafted these plans to pull Australia into the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Which sounds like a really friendly trade agreement, but I'm guessing it was anything but.
It was brutal economic imperialism. They had this document from December 1941 called the Land Disposal Plan.
Land Disposal Plan.
Catchy. Right. It envisioned ruling Australia under a government general model as a puppet state. The cultural erasure they had planned was staggering.
Yeah, the document said Japanese would become the official language, right?
Yes, absolute censorship. They had a radio network plan called Asia for the Asiatics for propaganda. And education would pivot entirely to state Shinto and the emperor's divinity.
But, I mean, what was the ultimate prize? Why go through all this trouble to set up a puppet government and rewrite an education system thousands of miles away?
Economic exploitation, plain and simple. The Japanese war machine was desperate for total economic self-sufficiency.
Right, because of the U.S. embargoes before Pearl Harbor.
Exactly. So Australia was designated to be two things: the southern granary and the workshops mine.
So mining iron ore and coal to feed the Japanese heavy industry?
Yes, and wheat and beef to feed the troops. But here's a really specific detail from the plan's Australian wool was explicitly earmarked to make winter uniforms for the Kwantung Army.
The Kwantung Army, those are the troops up in Manchuria, right?
Yes, fighting in sub-zero temperatures. So you have sheep stations in the blazing Australian outback, keeping soldiers warm in the snows of China.
That level of globalized planning is just chilling. And knowing that this blueprint existed, how did the Australians prepare? Because they fully believed the invasion was imminent.
They prepared for the absolute worst. Prime Minister Curtin initiated a highly secret scorched earth policy.
The scorched earth policy. Basically, if the Japanese land, we leave them nothing but ashes.
Exactly. Actively denying them that southern granary.
Just think about the reality of that for a second. You're a farmer and your own government is telling you to prepare to burn your own crops. The sources talked about people training to drain their domestic water tanks into the dirt and sink their own dinghies.
The psychological toll was just immense. They even trained these citizen squads, the Volunteer Defense Corps, to ensure the Japanese got zero usable resources.
Living every single day waiting for warships on the horizon. It totally explains the Brolda panic we talked about earlier.
Right, the birds.
Yeah, early 1943, that guy on patrol sees the white shapes in the heat haze and screams, "God, Japanese bloody sailors."
I love that story. But the really quirky contrast here is that the only actual documented Japanese landing on the Australian mainland wasn't a massive army at all.
Wait, there actually was a landing?
Yeah, in January 1944. But it was just a tiny 10-man intelligence unit called the Matsuki-kan.
10 men? How did they even get there?
They just sailed down in a commandeered fishing boat.
A fishing boat? Against a country ready to burn itself to the ground?
They landed in Western Australia, wandered around for a couple of hours, shot some 8mm film, collected some rocks as souvenirs, and just left.
Unbelievable. They came, they saw, they took some rocks.
Completely undetected, too.
Okay, but let's play the what-if game for a second. What if the Japanese had managed to hold even a slice of northern Australia? How does that rewrite the rest of the war?
Well, it shifts everything geopolitically. As we said, Australia was MacArthur's indispensable base for the Southwest Pacific Area Command.
Right.
Without it, the famous Allied Island hopping campaign basically becomes logistically impossible in its original form.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. MacArthur would have been forced to stage his return from much further away, right? Like New Zealand.
Exactly. And staging from New Zealand means an exponentially longer, vastly more vulnerable supply chain.
So it slows the whole Pacific War down.
It would have extended it by years. And if that happens, the U.S. is forced to divert massive resources away from the Europe First strategy.
Oh, wow. So protecting the Pacific could have delayed the defeat of Nazi Germany.
Absolutely. The post-war map of Europe might have looked completely different.
All because of a boardroom debate in Tokyo. Well, let's quickly recap our journey today. We started with those intense Navy versus Army debates over ambition and reality. We looked at the absolute logistical nightmare that the Outback presented.
A nightmare that saved them, really.
Yeah. We covered those chilling puppet state plans and, of course, the extreme scorched earth paranoia on the home front.
And you know, while we now know a full invasion was never truly on the table, understanding this what-if really highlights how incredibly fragile global security was in 1942.
So true.
The decisions made in those Tokyo boardrooms literally shaped the modern democratic order of the Pacific.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one final, totally bizarre historical footnote to mull over. After that tiny 10-man recon mission returned to Japan in 1944, an officer actually suggested they should send a fleet to land 200 Japanese convicts on the Australian coast.
Politics.
Yeah, just 200 convicts to start a guerrilla campaign in the outback. So I just want you to imagine an alternate timeline where the terrifying invasion of Australia was just 200 convicts running around the desert. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives, and we'll see you next time.